He said it quietly, the way he said most things. The dining room was full. Cousins crowded along both sides of the long table his grandmother had owned for 40 years. Aunts refilling glasses without being asked. Uncles already arguing about something that had happened at a different dinner 3 years ago. The kind of room that generates its own weather. Warm, loud, slightly suffocating if you'd been in it longer than an hour. His name was Caleb. He was 41 years old. He was sitting at the far end of the table, nearest the kitchen, in the chair nobody fought over, and he had just said, calmly, between bites, that the Whitmore Group's new development on the east side of the city was going to fail within 18 months. That was all he said. The table didn't go quiet. It absorbed the comment, the way rooms like this always absorbed things Caleb said. Briefly, partially, and then efficiently discarded. His cousin Darnell, who wore his watch like a credential, looked up from his plate. Whitmore Group? A small smile. Caleb, they just closed a $40 million deal. It was in the paper. I know, Caleb said. Then what are you basing that on? Caleb looked at his food. The debt structure. There was a pause. Then his Aunt Renee, his mother's sister, a woman who had an opinion about every room she entered, reached over and placed her hand on Caleb's forearm with the specific gentleness people reserve for children who have said something embarrassing in public. Baby, she said, Darnell works in finance. He knows these things. Caleb nodded once. Darnell was already moving on, already talking to someone else, already somewhere more interesting. He had a new car outside and a title on his business card that ran to 4 words, and he had no reason to spend another second on whatever Caleb was saying about debt structures. Nobody did. Caleb picked up his glass. Across the table, his mother's eyes found his for a moment. Not unkind, but apologetic in a specific way that meant, please don't. He gave her a small nod back that meant, I know. I won't. He never did. What he did not say, sitting at the end of that table in the chair nobody fought over, was that he had reviewed Whitmore Group's financial filings personally. He did not say that 3 of the development's anchor tenants were subsidiaries of a holding company his firm had quietly acquired 14 months ago. He did not say that those leases contained a specific clause buried in paragraph 19 of the commercial agreement that allowed for termination with 60 days' notice under certain conditions of ownership transfer. He did not say any of it. He ate his food, accepted a second helping from his grandmother, and let Darnell explain the real estate market to the rest of the table for another 20 minutes. The question that should have occurred to at least one person in that room, but did not, was a simple one. Why does Caleb know about the debt structure of a $40 million development? Nobody asked it. That was the thing about Caleb. People had stopped asking questions about him a long time ago, and he had stopped correcting them even longer ago than that. Before we go further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy powerful, emotional stories filled with betrayal, secrets, and unforgettable revenge, don't forget to subscribe to Black Plight Tales, because this story, it only gets crazier from here. The family had a story about Caleb, the way families always have stories about the one who didn't fit the pattern. The story went like this. Caleb had been given every advantage his cousins had been given. Same neighborhood, same schools, same grandmother who pushed all of them, and he had done the least with it. Darnell had gone into finance. His cousin Petra had become a corporate attorney. His cousin Raymond had opened 3 restaurants and was working on a 4th. His cousin Simone had a real estate license and a network and wore blazers that meant business. And Caleb had become what, exactly? He worked for something, a firm of some kind. Something with numbers, but not the impressive kind of numbers. He drove a sensible car. He lived in a modest house on a quiet street. He had never gotten married, though he had come close once, and he did not talk about that. He showed up to family events, ate his food, said little, and left at a reasonable hour. The family had a word for this. Several words, actually, deployed at different volumes depending on who was doing the talking. Passive, that was the polite one. Underachiever, that came from Aunt Renee, who had a theology about potential and believed strongly that wasted potential was a kind of moral failure. Odd. That came from the cousins, who had grown up watching Caleb sit in corners at parties, watching instead of performing, and had decided that watching was the behavior of someone who had nothing to offer. And from his Uncle Gerald, who said things directly and without apology. Worthless. Gerald had said it once at a cookout 3 years ago, not to Caleb's face, but 3 feet from it, in the way some people communicate things they want heard but want deniability for. He had said it to Darnell while gesturing in Caleb's direction. That boy has always been worthless. Smart enough, but no ambition, no drive. A pause. No backbone. Caleb had been standing near the grill. He had heard every word. He had turned the chicken over, checked the temperature, and said nothing. That was Caleb. That had always been Caleb. What none of them knew, what none of them had thought to ask about, was what Caleb actually did. The firm he worked for was called Alderton Capital Partners. It was not a flashy name. It did not have a glass tower with its logo on the side. It did not appear in the business section of the newspaper. Alderton Capital Partners operated, by design, entirely without profile. It managed a portfolio of assets, real estate holdings, equity positions, minority and majority stakes in operating companies, on behalf of a small number of clients who preferred, also by design, to be invisible. Caleb had joined Alderton 17 years ago as an analyst. He had become a partner at 34. He had become the managing partner at 38. This was not known to his family. It was not known because Caleb had never told them, and he had never told them because for the first several years, he had been waiting to tell someone specific. After that specific person was gone, it had stopped mattering whether anyone else knew. The specific person was a woman named Adaize. Not the name he'd been told to exclude. This was a different woman, a different story, a different ending. Her name was Diane. He had met Diane at 31, when he was still an analyst and she was finishing her MBA. She was sharp and quick and laughed in a way that made rooms rearrange themselves around her. He had been careful with her, deliberate in the way he was deliberate about everything, and she had read his carefulness as limitation. For 4 years, she waited for him to become someone whose ambitions matched hers. For 4 years, he said quiet things at dinner tables and drove a sensible car and wore simple clothes, and she watched the gap between what she'd hoped and what she saw widen into something she eventually decided was unbridgeable. The morning she left was a Tuesday. She had not made a scene. She was not the scene-making type. She had packed a bag, set her key on the kitchen counter, and said, not unkindly, but with the specific precision of someone who had rehearsed it, that she needed someone who showed up in the world, not just in the room. Caleb had looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. She left. He stood at the kitchen counter for a long time after the door closed. He looked at the key she had left. He did not pick it up. He made himself a cup of coffee and sat with it until it was cold, and then he went to work. He never told her what he managed. He never corrected the impression she had formed. He had wanted to know if someone would stay for the man in the room, not for the portfolio in the filing cabinet. He had his answer. The family trust had been established by Caleb's grandfather 43 years ago. His grandfather's name was Samuel, and Samuel had been a quiet man, the way Caleb was a quiet man, which was not coincidental. Samuel had built a modest construction business over 30 years, not large, but solid, and late in his life, on the advice of an estate attorney he had trusted, he had placed the assets of that business into a family trust designed to protect the family's accumulated wealth across generations. Samuel had died when Caleb was 11. By then, the trust held the business, a commercial property in the city's East District, and a small but significant portfolio of bonds. What happened next was the part the family had rewritten over time to suit their own understanding of it. What they believed? The trust had been managed by a series of professionals after Samuel's death. It had grown modestly. It currently held enough to make distributions to family members in meaningful amounts, and those distributions came quarterly, and everyone who received them was grateful for Samuel's foresight, without thinking too carefully about where the growth had come from. What was true? When Caleb joined Alderton Capital Partners at 24, one of the first things he had done, quietly, carefully, and entirely legally, was arrange for Alderton to take over management of the family trust. He had disclosed this to the trust's existing board, which consisted of his grandmother and 2 aging attorneys who had been relieved to hand the administrative burden to a professional firm. He had not disclosed it to anyone else in the family. The trust documents did not require him to. Over the next 17 years, under Alderton's management, the trust had grown from approximately $1.2 million to just under $19 million. The quarterly distributions the family received, the checks that allowed Darnell to maintain his lifestyle during a bad year in finance, the money that had helped Petra with her law school loans, the capital that had seeded Raymond's first restaurant, all of it flowed from a trust that Caleb managed through a firm Caleb ran via strategies Caleb had designed. They received the money. They did not know where it came from beyond a name on a statement, Alderton Capital Partners, trustee. They had never Googled it. They had never asked. Why would they? It was just the trust. It was something Samuel had set up. It ran itself. The family had a gathering twice a year, once in summer, once at the holidays. The summer gathering was the larger one, hosted on rotation. This year, it was at Raymond's house, which was the biggest and which Raymond always offered without being asked, because Raymond had learned early that offering things before being asked was a form of power. Raymond was 44. He was the closest thing the family had to a success story that everyone agreed on. 3 restaurants, the 4th in progress, a wife named Celestine who was beautiful and organized and ran the front of house at the flagship location. Raymond wore his success lightly, but wore it. It was always present, always available to reference. He had a way of talking about the business that was technically modest, but landed as a kind of continuous advertisement. Caleb liked Raymond. Raymond was not a bad man. He was simply a man who had decided that the point of achievement was to be seen achieving, and had arranged his life accordingly. The summer gathering this year had a new dimension. Raymond had announced 3 weeks prior that the family was going to make a collective investment. He had found an opportunity, a development project on the city's west side, a mixed-use property with residential above and commercial below, and he believed it was exactly the kind of thing their grandfather would have wanted the family to pursue together. He had sent a family group message about it. He had used the phrase generational wealth twice. He had also, Caleb noticed, suggested that the investment capital should come from the trust. Caleb had read the message on a Wednesday morning, sitting at his desk at Alderton, and had set his phone face down and returned to the document he'd been reviewing. At the summer gathering, it became the central topic within 40 minutes of everyone arriving. They gathered on Raymond's back deck, wide, beautifully maintained, overlooking a garden, and Raymond presented the opportunity with the ease of a man who had been waiting to present it. The developer was reputable. The location was excellent. The projected return over 7 years was conservative but solid. And the capital? Darnell asked. Trust covers it, Raymond said, with room. Heads nodded around the deck. Caleb was sitting slightly apart, near the railing, with a glass of water. Caleb, Raymond looked over at him. The tone was deliberate, not unkind, but with a specific quality. The quality of a man including someone who would not normally be included. What do you think? Every head on the deck turned toward him. Caleb considered the question. He knew the development Raymond was referring to. He knew the developer had reviewed his company's financials the previous year for a separate reason entirely. The projected return was not conservative. It was optimistic. The commercial units on the lower floor had 2 anchor tenants who were on 12-month leases, not long-term agreements, and the developer had structured the financing on the assumption that both would renew. One of them would not. Caleb knew this because the company that controlled that tenant was a portfolio company of a fund that Alderton had quietly taken a position in, and Caleb had seen the internal memo about their retail consolidation strategy. They were closing that location. It had already been decided. It just hadn't been announced yet. He looked at Raymond. "I think it carries more risk than the projected return accounts for," Caleb said. The deck absorbed this the way the dining room had absorbed his comment about the Whitmore Group. Briefly, and then efficiently. Raymond smiled, not dismissively, but with the particular patience of someone who has prepared for an obstacle and is not bothered by it. "Caleb, the developer has done 6 of these. The projections are based on their historical performance." "I know," Caleb said. "Then what's the risk you're seeing?" "Tenant stability." Raymond's wife, Celestine, who had been refilling a tray nearby, glanced over. Darnell shifted in his seat. Aunt Renee looked at Caleb with an expression that was somehow simultaneously loving and pitying. "Baby," she said, the same word, the same tone as the dining room. "Raymond has been in this business for 15 years. He knows how to evaluate a deal." Petra, who was a corporate attorney, and therefore the person in the room with the most professional credibility to speak on financial matters, added, "The trust has the capital. The risk profile seems acceptable. I've looked at the documents." "I haven't said no," Caleb said quietly. "You haven't said yes either," Darnell said. The deck waited. And then Uncle Gerald, who had been sitting in the corner with a beer and the expression of a man who has been waiting to speak, set his bottle down and said what he said with the flat, declarative certainty of someone who has never been wrong in his own living room. "This is the problem with Caleb. Always has been. You bring something to the table, something real, something good, and he sits there and picks at it. Doesn't build anything, doesn't take any chances. Just sits there and tells you why things won't work." He looked directly at Caleb. "Worthless. I'm sorry, but that's the word. You are 41 years old and you have contributed nothing to this family." The deck went quiet. Not the warm, generative quiet of a room between conversations. The cold quiet of something that has crossed a line. Caleb's mother, seated 2 chairs away from Gerald, pressed her lips together and looked at the garden. Raymond had the decency to look uncomfortable. Celestine found something to do near the door. Caleb set his glass of water down on the railing with a small, precise movement. He looked at Gerald for a long moment. Gerald met his gaze with the confidence of a man who believed he had just said a necessary truth. "All right," Caleb said. He picked up his glass again. And then, because this was who he was, because this was always who he was, he said calmly to Raymond, "I'll review the documents this week. Send them to me directly." Raymond nodded, visibly relieved. The conversation moved on. The deck breathed again. Caleb finished his water. He stayed for another hour, spoke when spoken to, helped carry chairs inside when the evening got cool, said goodbye to his grandmother with a kiss on her cheek that lasted slightly longer than his usual, and drove home. He sat in his driveway for a few minutes after he turned the engine off. Then he went inside and called his associate. Her name was Priya. She had been with Alderton for 9 years and was the only person, outside of the trust's founding documents, who understood the full architecture of what Caleb managed. "I need you to pull the full trust structure tomorrow," he said. "All positions, all current distributions, and pull the Alderton Partnership Agreement, the clause about managing partner discretion on trust assets." Priya was quiet for a moment. She had worked with Caleb long enough to understand what questions not to ask. "What are we looking at?" she said. "Nothing yet," Caleb said. "I just want to see the whole picture laid out." He hung up. He sat in his dark living room. He was not angry. He had not been angry at the deck. He was not, if he was honest with himself, even particularly surprised. What he was, and this was new, or at least newly clarified, was done. Not done with the family. Done with the silence. done with the particular posture he had held for 17 years, which was the posture of a man content to be underestimated, content to sit at the end of the table and say quiet things that nobody heard, and drive home and manage, in the dark and without acknowledgement, the financial life of every person who had just called him worthless. He was not going to make a dramatic announcement. He was not going to arrive at the next gathering with a presentation. He was not going to raise his voice or send a group message or make anyone feel what they had made him feel. He was simply going to stop managing the consequences of their assumptions. What that looked like, practically, would depend on the documents Priya pulled. But Caleb already knew what the documents would say. He had written most of the relevant clauses himself. The documents said what he knew they would say. The family trust, as currently structured, named Alderton Capital Partners as the sole trustee with full discretionary authority over investment decisions, distribution timing, and asset management. The managing partner of Alderton, which was Caleb, held, per the partnership agreement, unilateral authority over all trust-related decisions, subject to an annual review by the trust's advisory board. The advisory board currently consisted of his grandmother, Dorothy, and 2 attorneys who deferred entirely to Alderton's professional judgment. The trust's assets, as of the most recent quarterly statement, were as follows: $19.3 million in managed equity positions, bonds, and cash equivalents, a commercial property in the city's East District, held in the trust's name, currently leased to 2 tenants on long-term agreements that Caleb had personally renegotiated 3 years ago at significantly improved terms. Minority positions in 4 operating companies, one of which was Raymond's Restaurant Group. That last item was the one Caleb sat with longest. Raymond had taken a business loan 8 years ago when the first restaurant was struggling and the second had not yet opened. He had gone to 3 banks and been turned down at 2. The third had offered him terms he couldn't sustain. He had come to the family in some distress, and the family, after a discussion, had agreed that the trust should take a small equity position, 15%, in exchange for a capital injection that had saved the business. Raymond knew about this. It was in the documents he had signed. What Raymond did not know, what had not come up in 8 years because it had not needed to, was that Alderton had subsequently acquired additional equity in the restaurant group through a separate transaction, purchasing shares from an early outside investor who had wanted to exit. That additional acquisition had been made by Alderton on behalf of the trust, which meant the trust now held, in aggregate, a 31% equity position in Raymond's Restaurant Group. 31% was not a controlling interest, but it was, combined with the original 15, a significant minority that gave the trust, and therefore Caleb, the right to request a full financial audit, to review expansion plans, and to block certain major transactions without trustee approval, including, Caleb noted, the withdrawal of trust capital for new investments. He closed the document folder and leaned back in his chair. The charitable gala was in 6 weeks. It was an annual event, the city's largest nonprofit fundraiser, attended by the people whose names were on buildings and whose checks funded the organizations that everything else depended on. Raymond had become a significant donor over the past 3 years, and this year he had been named a co-chair of the event. He had, in the family group message 2 weeks ago, mentioned this with his particular brand of visible modesty, humbled to be serving the community in this way. He had invited the whole family to attend as his guests. Caleb had RSVP'd yes. He had done so before the deck. He had not un-RSVP'd after it. He had, instead, spent the 2 weeks following the deck doing something he had not done in 17 years. He had let people see him. Not loudly, not suddenly, not in a way that would alarm anyone or invite the wrong questions. But Caleb had called his grandmother and spent 2 hours with her, asking her to tell him everything she remembered about his grandfather's intentions for the trust. He had called his mother and had a long conversation about the family, a real one, not the polite orbiting they had settled into. And he had, at the end of that conversation, told her gently that he wanted her to know something before anyone else did. And he had told her what he did, what Alderton was, what the trust was, and what his role in it had been for 17 years. His mother had been quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "Why didn't you just tell us?" He thought about the question. He thought about Diane and the key on the counter and the quality of love he had been trying to protect. "Because I wanted people who saw me," he said, "not what I managed." His mother cried quietly for a moment. He let her. "And now?" she said. "Now I think it's time to show the picture clearly," he said, "before someone makes a decision that can't be undone." In the meantime, there was the matter of the investment. Raymond had sent the development documents as promised. Caleb had reviewed them. His assessment had not changed. The tenant risk was real, and the projected return assumed a stability that the documents didn't support. The anchor tenant in the commercial unit was a retail company that Caleb knew, through Alderton's position in a parent fund, was executing a contraction strategy. The lease was 12 months. It would not be renewed. He drafted a 4-page memo. It was technical, precise, and complete. It laid out the risk factors, the specific clause in the tenant agreement that indicated fragility, and a recommendation: hold the trust capital. If Raymond wished to pursue the investment personally, that was his prerogative. Trust assets should not be committed. He sent it to Raymond. He CC'd the trust's attorneys. Raymond called him within an hour. "Caleb." The voice was careful, controlled. Raymond was good at controlled. "I've read the memo." "Okay," Caleb said. "Where are you getting the tenant information? Because I've spoken to the developer, and they have assurances from the tenant that the lease is renewing." "Assurances aren't documents." A pause. "This is a 7-year play, Caleb. One tenant doesn't sink it. One anchor tenant in a development financed on commercial occupancy rates does?" Another pause. Longer. "Is this about what Uncle Gerald said?" Raymond asked. Caleb looked at the ceiling. "No. Because if it is, I want you to know I don't share his views." "What he said was out of line, and I told him so privately." "I appreciate that," Caleb said. And he did, genuinely. Raymond was not a bad man. "This is about the numbers. The numbers don't support the deployment." Raymond exhaled. "So you're blocking it." "I'm recommending against it. If the full advisory board wants to override my recommendation, they can convene and vote." The line was quiet for a moment. "Caleb," Raymond said, and there was something different in his voice now. Something that was trying to work out a puzzle. "How exactly does your firm have authority over a trust deployment recommendation?" "Because Alderton is the trustee," Caleb said simply. "Managing partner discretion. It's in the founding documents." A very long pause. "And you're the managing partner," Raymond said slowly. "Yes." "Since when?" 7 years. Silence. "And before that?" "I was a partner." "Since year 9. He heard Raymond breathing on the other end of the line. He could almost hear the recalibration happening, the rapid, uncomfortable revision of a story Raymond had been telling himself for a long time. "Why didn't you ever—" Raymond stopped, started again. "Why have you never said anything about this?" Caleb thought about it. He thought about the deck. He thought about Gerald. He thought about Aunt Renee's hand on his forearm and the specific tenderness reserved for people not expected to understand. "I don't know," he said, which was not entirely true, but was as much truth as the phone call required. "Send me an update when the tenant situation resolves one way or the other. I'll revisit the recommendation then." He hung up. The days between that call and the gala were quiet in the way that Caleb's days usually were, which is to say, they were busy and invisible. He managed 7 other client portfolios alongside the trust. He had a team of 6 at Alderton. He had a standing Thursday lunch with Priya to review the week's positions. He went to the gym. He drove his sensible car. He graded the world as it came at him with the same steady, quiet attention he had always brought to everything. What was different was that Raymond had told Darnell, and Darnell had told Petra. And Petra, because she was a lawyer and because she had pulled the trust documents herself after the call, a move that Caleb respected, had called him directly. "I read the Alderton partnership agreement," she said. She skipped hello, which he appreciated. "Okay," he said. "You have full discretionary authority?" "Yes." "Over the whole trust?" "Yes." "Including the equity position in Raymond's restaurant group?" "Yes." A pause. "The full 31%. There it was. She had found the second acquisition. He should have expected it. She was thorough. "Yes," he said. "Caleb." A careful silence. "What is happening here?" "Nothing is happening," he said. "The trust is managed. The assets are protected." The quarterly distributions continue exactly as they have. And the investment Raymond wants to make? I've explained my concerns. They stand. "He's furious," she said. "I know." "Gerald is saying—" She stopped. "I can imagine what Gerald is saying," Caleb said. "He's saying you're doing this because of what he said at the gathering, that you're using whatever authority you have to punish the family." Caleb looked out his office window. The city was gray and still below. "The quarterly distributions have been consistent for 17 years, he said. "I have never missed one. I have never reduced one. I have grown the trust from 1.2 million to 19.3 million without a single family member asking how. I have managed this trust through 2 recessions, a market correction, a global disruption, and 6 family emergencies where distributions were needed outside the regular schedule. I have done all of this quietly, consistently, and without acknowledgement, while sitting at the end of the table." He paused. "Gerald can say what he wants." The line was very quiet. "Caleb," Petra said, and her voice had changed. The attorney voice had dropped, and what was under it was something older and simpler. "I'm sorry." "You don't need to be sorry." "Yes, I do. We all do. I knew something about you didn't add up with the story we told. I chose not to ask." A pause. "That was a choice." He nodded, though she couldn't see it. "I'll see you at the gala," he said. "Raymond invited everyone." "Are you going?" "Yes." The charity gala was held at the Meridian, the city's oldest and largest event venue, a building that had hosted every consequential social gathering for 40 years. It was exactly the kind of room that Raymond had worked to belong to, and this year he co-chaired it, which meant his name was on the program and his table was near the front, and the evening was, in some significant sense, his. He had earned this. Caleb wanted to be clear with himself about that. Raymond had built real things. His restaurants employed real people. His donations to the foundation had funded real programs. The co-chair title was not undeserved. It was just, and this was what the evening would make undeniable, built on a floor that someone else owned. The family arrived together, a small convoy of cars, and Caleb arrived separately and slightly later, as he usually did. He wore a dark suit that was well made, but not loud. He wore it the way he wore everything, as a thing to keep the cold out, not as a statement. He was shown to Raymond's table. The family was already seated. Darnell was in a new suit. Aunt Renee had on a formal gown. Gerald was there, which Caleb had not anticipated but processed without reaction. Gerald looked at him when he sat down. There was something in the look, not an apology. Gerald was not equipped for those, but something slightly more cautious than usual. Raymond had clearly talked to him. "Caleb," Raymond said from across the table. Formal. Careful. "Raymond," Caleb said. Congratulations on the co-chair." Raymond accepted this with a nod. Celestine touched Caleb's arm and said she was glad he came. He believed her. The evening proceeded with the choreography of these events. Cocktails, seating, a welcome address, dinner, speeches, the live auction, dancing. Raymond's co-chair moment came during the speeches, when he stood at the podium with the easy confidence of a man who had prepared and spoke about the community and legacy and his grandfather's influence on how he understood what it meant to give back. Caleb listened. Raymond was a good speaker. He meant what he said. And there was something both moving and clarifying about hearing his cousin stand at that podium and trace his own sense of purpose back to a man, their grandfather, Samuel, whose trust Caleb had been quietly building for 17 years. The speeches ended. The auction concluded. The dancing began. And then, at 9:47 in the evening, the foundation's executive director, a woman named Gloria, who had known the family for 20 years, approached the table and sat down in an empty chair next to Raymond, with a look on her face that Caleb recognized as the look of someone who has just encountered unexpected information. "Raymond," she said, keeping her voice low, "I need to ask you something about the development proposal." Raymond's expression shifted slightly. "What proposal?" "The West Side development." "I received a call today from the developer. He told me he'd approached the foundation about a naming opportunity, a partnership tied to an anchor investment from the family trust." She paused. "He mentioned you'd given him authorization to discuss the trust as a committed capital source." The table had gone quiet. Caleb kept his face entirely still. Raymond's jaw set slightly. "Gloria, that's a misunderstanding. The trust investment is still under review." "He had a letter," Gloria said carefully. "On trust letterhead." "That's not possible," Raymond said. Gloria looked at the table. Then she looked at Caleb. "Caleb," she said, "you're Alderton, aren't you? I saw your name on the trust statement years ago, and I never connected it until someone mentioned it to me this week." Every head at the table turned toward Caleb. He looked at Gloria steadily. "Yes," he said. "Has the trust authorized the developer's announcement?" "No," Caleb said. Gloria nodded slowly. She looked at Raymond. Raymond was very still. "Raymond," Caleb said, and his voice was even and quiet, the way it had been at every dinner table in every room for 40 years. "Did you tell the developer the capital was committed?" Raymond said nothing for a moment. "I told him it was likely," Raymond said. His voice was careful. "I believed it was." "Based on what?" A pause. A specific, terrible pause. The pause of a man who had, in his confidence and in his certainty about how things worked, told a developer that the capital would come because he had never seriously imagined that anyone would stop it. Because the trust had always been something that ran itself, something inherited, something that belonged to all of them equally. And the idea that his quiet cousin at the end of the table had any actual authority over it had not, until very recently, been a real consideration. "Based on how I understood the trust to work?" Raymond said quietly. The table was completely silent. And then Uncle Gerald, who had been sitting very still in his chair, said in a voice that had lost all of its earlier certainty, "Caleb, what exactly is your role here?" Caleb looked at his uncle. "I'm the managing partner of Alderton Capital Partners," he said. "Alderton has been the sole trustee of the Samuel Alderton Family Trust for 17 years. I have full discretionary authority over all trust assets, investment decisions, and distributions, including the quarterly checks everyone at this table receives." The silence that followed was not the dining room silence or the deck silence. It was a different kind altogether. It was the silence of a story collapsing. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, completely, and without the possibility of being unheard. Gerald's face did something complicated, a series of small calculations running visibly behind his eyes. The check he received quarterly. The check he had received for 17 years. The check that was, it was now becoming clear, issued at the discretion of a man he had called worthless in front of his own family, while Caleb stood 3 feet away and turned the chicken on the grill. "The developer's announcement is not authorized," Caleb said to Gloria. "I'll have the trust attorneys send a formal clarification tomorrow. The development investment has not been approved and will not be approved on the current information." Gloria nodded. She looked at Raymond once more, not unkindly, but with the specific expression of someone who has had to have a harder version of this conversation than they anticipated, and she excused herself. Caleb picked up his water glass. Darnell was staring at the tablecloth. Petra was looking at Caleb with something that was not quite admiration and not quite grief, but held elements of both. Celestine had placed her hand over Raymond's on the table. Aunt Renee, who had placed her hand on Caleb's arm at 2 separate dinner tables with the tenderness reserved for people not expected to understand, was looking at him now with an expression he had not seen her direct at him before. She looked, for the first time, like she was seeing him. "Caleb," she said. "Not baby, just Caleb." "It's all right," he said. And he meant it in the way he meant things, quietly and completely. "The trust is fine. The distributions are fine." Nothing is changing. He looked around the table once, steady and unhurried. "I just need the decisions about it to be made on accurate information." Raymond lifted his eyes from the tablecloth. They were the eyes of a man who had just had a significant revision forced upon him, and who was, to his credit, looking at it directly. "I owe you an apology," Raymond said. "You don't need—" "Yes, I do." He said it firmly. "An apology and an explanation. For the deck. For what Gerald said. For the way we've all—" He stopped. Started again. "For a long time. I accepted the deck a long time ago," Caleb said. "That makes it worse," Raymond said quietly. Caleb looked at his cousin. Raymond, in this moment, without the performance of success around him, was simply a man who had built real things and told a false story about someone he should have paid more attention to. He was not a villain. He was something more ordinary and more forgivable than that. "Send me the development documents again," Caleb said. "Properly this time. If the tenant situation resolves the way I told you it won't, and I could be wrong, though I don't think I am, we'll revisit. If I'm right, we'll find you a better deal." Raymond looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded. Gerald had not spoken since Caleb's answer. He was sitting in his chair with his beer, and he was looking at nothing in particular. And the silence around him was the specific silence of a man sitting inside a sentence he had said and could not take back. Caleb looked at him. "Gerald," he said. Gerald looked up. "I've been managing the trust for 17 years, Caleb said. "The same trust that sent Darnell's kids to summer camp, that covered Petra's bar exam fees, that gave Raymond the liquidity to open the second restaurant." He paused. "I didn't do any of that because I wanted credit for it. I did it because it was what needed to be done, and I was the one who could do it. But I need you to understand what I'm telling you." Gerald was very still. "All right," Caleb said. He stood, straightened his jacket, and said goodnight to his grandmother, who was seated at the far end of the table, and had, he suspected, understood more of this than anyone. She took his hand when he leaned down to kiss her cheek, and held it for a moment. "Your grandfather knew," she said quietly. "Knew what, Grandma?" "That you were the one," she said. "He told me before he died. He said, 'Dorothy, watch Caleb. He's the quiet one. Those are the ones who carry things. Caleb held her hand for a moment. He was right, his grandmother said. He was always right. Caleb kissed her cheek. He straightened up. He walked through the meridian, through the crystal and the candlelight and the civic performance of wealth and generosity, and out into the cool night air. And he drove home in his sensible car to his quiet house on his quiet street. And he sat at his kitchen table, and it was the same kitchen table it had always been. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel vindicated in any dramatic sense. What he felt was the quiet, specific satisfaction of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has finally set it down. Not thrown it, not used it as a weapon, just set it down, gently, in a room where people could finally see what it was. 6 months later, the West Side development ran into exactly the trouble Caleb had predicted. The anchor tenant announced its retail contraction strategy in October. The lease termination notice followed in November. The developer spent December scrambling to replace a commercial tenant that had underwritten the financing. By January, the project was in restructuring conversations with the bank. Raymond called Caleb in February. "You were right," he said. "I know," Caleb said, not unkindly. "I would have lost the trust capital." "Yes." A pause. "Thank you." "Send me the new deal when you find one," Caleb said. "Something with longer lease terms." Raymond did, 6 weeks later. A different developer, a different structure, a stronger tenant mix. Caleb reviewed it for 4 days, ran the numbers 3 ways, consulted with Priya, and approved the deployment. The investment performed well. Darnell stopped wearing his watch like a credential. Or rather, Caleb noticed, he simply wore it, without the performance. Something had shifted in him the night of the gala, some foundational assumption about the architecture of the family. He started calling Caleb occasionally. Not often, but occasionally, to talk about things. Markets, positions, a deal he was thinking about. He asked questions and listened to the answers. Petra sent a note, handwritten, on paper, which was the most Petra thing she could have done. It said, "I should have asked. I'm sorry I didn't. I won't make that mistake again." She had signed it with just her name, no title. Aunt Renee baked a pie and brought it to Caleb's house on a Tuesday, which was not a holiday or a gathering day, and stayed for 2 hours and talked and listened in equal measure, which was the most significant behavioral revision Caleb had observed in her in his entire adult life. Gerald never apologized. Gerald was not built for apologies. But he stopped saying what he said, which was its own form of acknowledgement. And when he saw Caleb at family events, there was something in how he positioned himself, slightly reduced, slightly turned, as if calibrating for a presence he had previously decided to ignore, that said everything the words didn't. As for the trust, it continued. Quarterly distributions continued. The commercial property in the East District was renegotiated again at even better terms. Caleb brought in a new tenant, a regional company with a 10-year agreement, which increased the property's income stream and, by extension, the trust's overall yield. He found a new position for the trust portfolio, a carefully structured equity stake in a healthcare logistics company that Alderton had been watching for 2 years and that performed, in its first 18 months, above projection. The trust, which had been $19.3 million at the time of the summer gathering, was $2.1 million larger 12 months later. Nobody called a meeting about it. Nobody held a press conference. Nobody sent a group message. It just grew, the way things grow when someone who knows what they're doing is quietly paying attention. Caleb's mother asked him once, after all of it, the question she had been building toward for months. "Do you wish you'd told us sooner?" He thought about it, genuinely.